So good morning and a warm welcome to ILA webinar on resolution plan under insolvency and bankruptcy code. Myself Madhura, I welcome you on behalf of Indian Lawyers Association. We are a not-for-profit organization with about 70-75 chapters all over India, and we are working towards making a common voice of lawyers by way of giving them platform for networking. We arrange education workshops, events for them, and there are a lot of mentoring and guidance initiatives that we run parallel to our regular events. So before we begin, let me just quickly give you a short introduction to our speakers for the day. We have Mr. Bhargav Hemige, Advocate, IC Universal Legal. Bhargav carries a blend of experience in commercial laws and corporate litigation. He is experienced in drafting of commercial documents, contracts, financing documents, and effectively advising clients on various legal issues and procedures. Then we have Mr. Rishabh Singh, Legal Manager, Resurgent India Limited. He is experienced legal associate with a history of working in financial industries with a focused area of work in debt restructuring and insolvency. He has been handling end-to-end corporate insolvency resolution and liquidation process and managing the operations of the company and the corporate insolvency resolution process. We have Ms. Richa Saraf, Manager, Legal in Sumedha Management Solutions Private Limited. She has extensive experience in corporate and finance laws and has worked with NBFC clients, startups, and other corporate firms. She has a significant exposure in corporate litigation, having represented clients before the national company law tribunals. Mr. Sumit Kumar, Principal Associate, Karma Law Advocates and Legal Consultants. Sumit carries a rich experience in handling civil and commercial litigation and representing MNCs, corporate entities, HNIs, financial institutions before courts and tribunals. He provides end-to-end support to startups in drafting various binding agreements, providing legal opinions, and representing them before different courts and tribunals. Our moderator for the day, Mr. Gagan Kumar, is the founder of Krishnomics Legal. He has an extensive experience in litigation and advisory aspects of the tax practice. He also sits on board of several companies as independent director. Mr. Gagan is regularly invited to speak by the television media as well as at events and webinars across the country. He heads the ILA Delhi chapter in the capacity of president. Gagan sir, I hand it over to you now.
Thank you, Madhura, and very good morning to all of you. Today, the idea is to discuss a very new law. It's only 5 years that this bankruptcy, insolvency and bankruptcy code was legislated. But in the past 5 years, we have seen the humongous amount of litigation and the evolution in the law which has happened. And what we intend to do today is that we have these four bright lawyers who would be taking us through various aspects of the insolvency bankruptcy code. Now, just to give as a brief exordium, the law was brought with an intent to simplify and revive the companies who were not being able to repay their loan or who were defaulting. And as a result, the Presidency Towns Insolvency Act and Provincial Insolvency Act, they both were repealed and Insolvency Bankruptcy Code was introduced. Correspondingly, there were amendments made in the Companies Act, a Partnership Act, and Excise, Income Tax, and SARFAESI and Sikh Industrial Companies Act as well. Now, have we been able to achieve the object which was sought to be achieved by introduction of this law? What are the challenges, whether the resolution plan which were originally envisaged to hasten the process and to unburden the banks with the bad loans, or to hasten the process of recovery, whether all those objects have been achieved or not. So we will be going through various aspects, and I give it back to Madhura now to take it from there. Thanks, Madhura. Just one request, if any of you have any questions during the session, please keep putting them in chat box. We will take up those questions once all the speakers are through with their presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. So may we begin with the presentations from our speakers. I request Mr. Sumit Kumar to begin his presentation.
Yes. First of all, thank you for this opportunity. I will share my screen. Please let me know if you can view this. Is it visible now?
Yes.
Yes, it is visible.
Okay. So the topic which I have with me today is the differential between secured and unsecured creditor in a resolution plan. So before beginning this particular presentation, the differential between unsecured and secured creditor is a very, very tricky one if it comes to the practicalities which we as a lawyer face during the before the NCLT or the appellate tribunal or even before the Supreme Court. So through this presentation, I would rather try to ensure that the perspective with which the legislature has enacted the differential between the secured and unsecured creditors, and to what extent the courts and tribunals are standing up to it. So to begin with, this is the first page talks about the introduction of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, which was, to my understanding, was promulgated to envisage the control mechanism of the creditors. And this was basically done with the primary objective to not only make the recovery mechanism very stoic, rather to generate the prospects of the revival of the corporate against which the insolvency proceeding has started under the IBC. So to begin with, this should be the primary understanding that one should have before even start reading the IBC, to my understanding. And to the next page, which talks about the definition of secured creditors and the unsecured creditors. It is very important to understand the secured creditors and unsecured creditors under the insolvency regime. I mean, under the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. Because there are various understandings with respect to secured creditors and unsecured creditors. And coming back to the IBC, what we have right now has been provided in this page. So secured creditors defined under section 3 subsection 30 of the IBC 2016. The secured creditor means a creditor in favor of whom security interest is created. So that is a very simple and straightjacket kind of sort of definition which the IBC has given to the secured creditor. And to understand the meaning of security interest, which has been used in this particular definition, we need to understand what security interest is. And to that, IBC has also covered that definition under section 3 subsection 31, which states that security interest means right, title, or interest created in favor or provided for a secured creditor by a transaction, and by a transaction which secures payment or performance of an obligation, and includes mortgage, charge, hypothecation, assignment, and encumbrance, or any other arrangement securing payment or performance of any obligation of any person. So the definition, perhaps to be very clear, the IBC has the legislature under the IBC regime has provided that the security interest basically relies on two things. First is what sort of obligation is there, and against that obligation, what do you really have? So the security interest talks about the right or the title or the interest or your claim over a property against what, and the what is defined by way of these 3 or 4 things which have been defined under this particular definition, which includes mortgage, charge, hypothecation, assignment, and encumbrance. So to understand in totality the concept of secured interest, we need to understand the concept of security. I mean, to understand the concept of secured creditor, we need to understand the concept of security interest in totality. Then only we can understand what is a secured creditor under the IBC. Secondly, coming to unsecured creditor is not defined under IBC. So one has to take help from other sources, the definitions which have been provided, the definitions which have been drawn, the references which have been drawn from the judgments which have been given from different courts, tribunals. So the unsecured creditor, since it's not defined, the Black Laws Dictionary described the unsecured debt as a debt that does not have a security. So even before you start reading, you can very well understand that it is a complete opposite of what we have just read. I mean, the definition of the secured creditor and the security interest, which obviously plays a very important role in the definition of secured creditor. So coming back to the definition which of the unsecured creditor, it says that a debt that does not have a security or collateral pledged, full stop. In the event the debtor defaults, the creditor cannot seize any property which the loan may have been used to purchase. The creditor may only sue for money damages pursuant to a judgment. So even if it's not defined in the IBC, it's very clear that the quantum or the extent of right which is bestowed in this particular definition with respect to the unsecured creditor is very clear at this point of time. So the extent to which an unsecured creditor can go to realize its right, or the claim which, if we talk about IBC, the claim which it has is very much quantified, is very much defined under this particular definition. Again, the Cambridge Dictionary definition, which says a person or organization that has lent money and has no right to the property or other assets of the borrower if the money is not paid back. Again, the same thing. We can very well see that the extent to which the unsecured creditor can go by far to realize the money which it has given to the person is very limited. And to understand again, coming back to the secured and unsecured creditor, the very important portion of both the definition is creditor. So the definition of creditor is also defined under IBC, which says it is defined under section 3, subsection 10. It says that the creditor means any person to whom a debt is owed and includes a financial creditor, an operational creditor, a secured creditor, an unsecured creditor, and a decree holder. Now, there's a tricky part. If you see the definition here of the creditor under IBC, by just reading it out, you would not feel that the legislature at this particular point of time has tried to demarcate or to classify the differences which we have seen in so many judgments and so many articles, reports between different classes of creditor. So here the meaning of the creditor is very simple. It includes a financial creditor, an operational creditor, a secured creditor, and unsecured creditor. So it has perhaps include all the kinds of creditor, including the secured creditor and an unsecured creditor and a decree holder. Again, coming back to the next slide, it says the thoughts regarding definition of creditor. Again, what I was saying that it's very important to understand the definition of the creditor. Again, if it has not made such apparent distinction with respect to different class of creditors who can be included, because by not including any particular class of creditor, the legislature would have made things very clear. But now, by reading this definition, one might say that the legislature has not made any differentiation, because the meaning or the definition of the creditor includes every class of creditor, including the secured and the unsecured creditor, for which we are talking about right now. So it says that, as you must have seen, that the definition of the creditor is an inclusive definition wherein all kinds of creditors are included. There is no such differentiation made by the court under the definition between different kinds of creditors. The only requirement as per the definition to be adjudged as a creditor is the existence of debt. So the only important aspect of, or for a creditor to be adjudged as a creditor under the definition of creditor, which is defined under IBC, is the existence of debt. Now, debt is also defined under IBC. Debt is defined under section 3, subsection 11 of IBC. It says that debt means a liability or obligation in respect of a claim which is due from any person and includes a financial debt and operational debt. So here the debt is very clear. It could be a financial debt or an operational debt. Against what? Against a claim. For what? It means liability or an obligation in respect of what? A claim which is due from any person. That can be a financial debt or an operational debt. Now, financial debt is defined under section 5, subsection 8, and operational debt is defined under section 5, subsection 21 of the IBC. Now, coming to the next slide. I have tried to just explain the two kinds of debt in a very brief manner. So the financial debt as defined under section 5(8) of IBC primarily rests on two limbs, which are quotient of interest along with the debt. So if the debt, the supposed debt under the IBC, if an interest quotient is tagged along with it, then it is sufficient enough to be adjusted as an IBC, and it should not be understood as the only requirement to be adjusted as a financial debt under the IBC, but it is one of the requirements. The second requirement is consideration for time value of money. Suppose you have given a loan to somebody, so it should satisfy the stand or the requirement of time value of money. So it should not be given, it should be given you can, if in a layman term, you can try and understand that it should be given with a perspective that, okay, I am giving you this loan with an appropriated or a supposed return against this particular loan in particular set or in particular period of time. So if you try and understand this debt in such a manner, then you would probably be able to understand that why commercial, time value of money is so much important for a financial debt. So these are the two basic requirements to understand as to what a financial debt is under the IBC. And coming to the operational debt, it is also defined under section 5, subsection 21 of IBC. It states that operational debt means a claim in respect of the provision of goods or services, including employment, or a debt in respect of payment of dues arising under any law for the time being in force and payable to the central government, any state government, or any local authority. Now, moving any further, you would probably see at this point of time that the requirement of the quotient of interest that I just talked about and the consideration for time value of money makes financial debt way more than the operational debt, which is defined at this point of time and on this page, because the kind of weight or the kind of responsibility, you must say, attached with the financial debt is way higher than the quotient of all those things when it comes to operational debt. So before moving any further, you can have this perspective in your mind so as to understand why there is a differentiation between those two creditors. And then coming to the next slide, it talks about the Bankruptcy Law Reforms Committee and what does it have to say about the differentia. So it says that, I will read the underlying part. The members of the creditors committee have to be creditors both with the capability to assess viability as well as to be willing to modify the terms of existing liabilities in negotiation. Typically, operational creditors are neither able to decide on matters regarding the insolvency of the entity, nor willing to take the risk of postponing payments for better future prospects for the entity. The committee concluded that for the process to be rapid and efficient, the code will provide that the creditors committee should be restricted to only the financial creditors. Now, again, why I emphasized on understanding the difference between the two definitions of financial debt and operational debt. Also, it should be read with the difference between the definition of secured creditor and unsecured creditor is the sort of perspective which is given here. So why it has been done away or why it has been done in that manner can be understood by reading this particular observation of the Bankruptcy Law Reforms Committee. The very idea behind keeping the difference was to ensure a more concerned decision by the committee of creditors towards resolution of a distressed corporate and to keep the option of the liquidation as a last resort. So the sense of responsibility again comes into the picture, and as it way more higher than in case of financial creditor being the member of the committee of creditors. Therefore, that is the why they have been emphasized more than the unsecured or the operational creditors. Now, coming to the next page, the procedural requirements for the creditors to submit their claims. This is just a add-on which I have added. This is more of a procedural aspect which is attached with submitting the claims, and the creditors when have to submit the claims to the IRP or the RP after the public announcement, so as to substantiate their claims and to let the RP know that I am having a valid claim against the corporate which is undergoing the corporate insolvency resolution process, And against this claim, the financial creditor seeks a place in the committee of creditors. So this is only to give you a perspective about how the claims are made and how the seats in the committee of creditors are decided. Then coming to the next slide, it says that what is a resolution plan? Since we are talking about the unsecured and secured creditor and the differential between them in a resolution plan, so I've just given a very brief understanding of a resolution plan. Resolution plan can be adjusted as the instruments for taking over the operations of a distressed corporate. The plan consists of a proposal for payment of the creditors, restructuring the target. So here comes the different intentions of a resolution plan. I will read that this line again. The plan consists of a proposal for payment of the creditors, restructuring the target corporate, which is the corporate debtor undergoing the CIRP under the IBC, if required, and to provide a new lease of life to a dying corporate. The members of the COC are required to approve the plan by at least 66% of the votes. So the members of the COC have to vote at least by minimum 66%. If it can go way above that, it's okay, but it should be at least 66% to approve the resolution plan. The submission of resolution plan is covered under section 30 of the IBC, and section 31 states the approval of a resolution plan by the adjudicating authority. So I will just give you a small brief about this particular two sections. The submission of the resolution plan is something which comes at a point when a resolution applicant submits a resolution plan and it is being presented before the members of the COC. COC members deliberates upon the resolution plan, see the intricacies of the resolution plan, decide to what extent it could be beneficial for us, and then approve the resolution plan, as I just said, with at least 66% votes. If it can go higher, well and good. Then about the second section, section 31, it talks about when the resolution plan has been approved by the members of the COC, then what happens? The resolution plan is put forth before the adjudicating authority, which in this case would be National Company Law Tribunal of different states. And the National Company Law Tribunal will look into the only strict to the requirements which are defined in the 31, and if the resolution plan is in compliance with those requirements, the NCLT will approve the resolution plan. So these are the two sections which only comes into picture when the resolution plan has been approved and then it has been presented before the NCLT for the approval. Again, the next paras is very important. The claims of the creditors are governed by section 53 of the IBC 2016. Now, after the claims have been submitted, the resolution plan has been approved, then how are the claims are to be adjudged? Once the resolution plan has been approved, so how the claims are to be dealt in within the resolution plan so as to make sure that the members of the committee who have voted in for the approval of the resolution plan get what they wanted to get out of the resolution plan. I mean, to maximum possible extent, not necessarily the entire amount. The claims of the creditors are governed by section 53 of IBC 2016, which could be said to be the heart of the insolvency regime in India. It's very important. It's a very important section of IBC because it decides the fate of the different members of the committee of creditor. Many are usually very upset about the fact that the kind of claims that they get from the resolution plan. So all these prospects only come into picture when this particular section comes into play. So the claims of the creditors are governed by section 53 of IBC 2016, which could be said to be the heart of the insolvency regime in India. The said section entails the priority and the manner in which the claims of the creditor should be covered under a resolution plan. So it's a very important point. The said section entails the priority which is set in under section 53, and the manner in which the claims of the creditors, the manner is also set in under 53. That is the reason why I emphasize on this section. So both the things are very much included in this section, in which the claims of the creditors should be covered under a resolution plan. In order to be better placed to understand the priority mechanism, I would request everybody to read this section along with section 30 subsection 2, proviso attached with section 30 subsection 2, section 34 and regulation 38 of the CIRP regulations. It all talks about it related to the approval of the resolution plan. The next slide is in continuation of the previous slide. According to section 30 subsection 2, B, operational creditor must receive minimum liquidation value or the amount under resolution plan if distributed as per section 53, whichever is higher. If somebody is getting a higher value on basis of only on the basis of section 53, it is well and good. And apart from it, it should at least get the minimum liquidation value. That is what the section says. So it is by far safeguarding the interest of, trying to safeguard the interest of the operational creditors. The proviso of section 30 subsection 2 ensures a fair and equitable treatment to the creditors, meaning thereby all the creditors should be treated in an equal manner. This is what the section is trying to say, but there are some riders, which I will come to the riders at a later point of time. However, the Supreme Court made it clear that a fair and equitable treatment, this is a rider, of the creditors shall not mean that all the creditors can be treated equally. So unequals cannot be treated equals. I sincerely believe that all of you must have heard about this particular judgment, because this is one of those judgments which everybody looks into when they start practicing under this code. So it specifically says that the unequals cannot be treated as equals. Only if the equals are treated in an unequal manner, all those things come into picture, that inequality has been peeped in. So there is a constitutional provision which comes into picture. So only then when equals are treated unequally, where unequals are treated equally, there is no question of treated them equally, because they are not on the same footing. And again, according to section 30 subsection 4, COC may approve a resolution plan after considering feasibility and viability after taking into account the order of priority under section 53 subsection 1 of the IBC. Regulation 38 of CIRP regulation requires a resolution plan to be feasible and viable, and section regulation 39, which I believe I missed here, talks about the approval of the resolution plan. Again, the next slide talks about waterfall mechanism under section 53 of the IBC. So the numbered points that you see on this slide are the manner and the priority in which the claims are to be adjudged or the claims are to be decided under a resolution plan. So this is the priority which every resolution plan should adhere to in order to get it approved. So the first and foremost point is insolvency resolution process cost. So that is something which is incurred during the entire process of insolvency resolution of a particular corporate. Second comes the workman dues for 24 months and secured creditor 24 months from the liquidation commencement date. Employment dues for 12 months from the liquidation commencement date. Financial debts owed to unsecured creditors, statutory dues for 24 months from the liquidation commencement date, and remaining debts and dues. Whereas the unsecured creditors are ranked above the government dues, again, the legislature sets out the priority and the mechanism within section 53 of IBC. One may note that under section 53 of IBC 2016, the term secured creditor is mentioned and not financial creditor is mentioned. The rationale behind mentioning secured creditor is that a financial creditor may be secured creditor or an unsecured creditor. The sense of priority under section 53 essentially made clear by the legislation in this section. So the reason why it has been mentioned because the legislature wanted to make its intentions very clear. The intentions which I just talked about in my previous slides regarding secured, unsecured creditors and how they should be treated within this particular code. Now coming to the next slide, what does the Supreme Court have to say about secured and unsecured creditors? Again, this particular judgment is very important. So it says that the Supreme Court upheld the significance of the financial creditor over operational creditors. The Supreme Court held that the financial creditors, like banks and financial institutions, while granting lending money, are best equipped to adjust the feasibility and viability of the business of a corporate. Therefore, the Supreme Court laid emphasis over the larger interests of the financial creditors involved in the insolvency process of a corporate. Again, I would request everybody to recall the sense of responsibility that I just talked about in my previous slides with respect to financial creditor. It was actually in tandem with the preposition that has been set forth by this particular judgment by the Honorable Supreme Court. Now, the second judgment talks about the Committee of Creditors of SR Steel India Limited through authorized signatory versus Satish Kumar Gupta and others. The Supreme Court held that the premise drawn by NCLAT regarding the secured and unsecured creditors while dealing with them on the same footing was wrong. So this was precisely a very talked about judgment when the NCLAT said that all the creditors have to be treated equally. So the basic understanding which came out of this particular judgment was this when the NCLAT passed this. So it was then challenged before the Supreme Court, and it clearly stated that the premise drawn by the NCLAT regarding the secured and unsecured creditors while dealing with them on the same footing was absolutely wrong. In tandem with the objective of the IBC, the Supreme Court stated this. The Supreme Court held that it is permissible under the code to treat different class of creditors differently, provided those differences are on a fair and equitable ground. While drawing a line for adjudicating authorities, the Supreme Court said that the NCLT does not have any residual jurisdiction as the High Courts under Section 392 of the Companies Act 1956 to reject a plan on the ground that it is unfair or unjust to class of creditor. First part of this para will make you understand that the creditors, why they are not treated equally. The second part of this para will make you understand that the extent of jurisdiction which NCLT and NCLATs have. So the Supreme Court has set the record straight by this particular judgment, saying that there is a limit to the kind of jurisdiction NCLT and NCLAT can exercise when it comes to approval of the resolution plan and going into the intricacies and nitty-gritties of the resolution plan. So by this particular judgment, the Supreme Court has led the line for the NCLT and NCLAT, and also with respect to the different classes of the creditors and how they should be treated under the code. The next particular slide is perhaps in continuation of the previous slide. Now it gives you a situational jargon. Why? Because now what if the members of the COC decides to approve a plan? This is very practical. So I will, if the time permits, I will also let you know why this is practical and why I have faced it in my practical experience. So it says that what if the members of the COC decides to approve a resolution plan, despite of the fact I being an unsecured creditor, I am not satisfied with the resolution plan and the kind of repayment schedule that I am given under the resolution plan. However, in such a scenario, since the resolution plan has already been approved, the principle laid down in case Shashidhar versus Indian Overseas Bank, again, this is a very important judgment, comes into picture. It was held by the Supreme Court that scope of judicial scrutiny over a commercial decision taken by the COC is very limited. Again, drawing the line for the NCLT and NCLAT, which I just talked about. The Supreme Court re-emphasized the primacy of the decision taken by the members of the COC. So you must have read that there are a plethora of judgments which talks about the commercial wisdom of the COC. If the decision has been taken by the COC, then there is no point going into the calls made by the COC and how good they were at the point when they were made. So there is no point into it. If the decision has been taken, that is etched in stone. That is what Supreme Court by various judgments is trying to convey. Now there is also the other side of it. The next slide tells you the implication of Section 31 of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. In addition to the primacy of commercial wisdom of COC, this is in continuation of the previous slide. This is also one of the jargons which the unsecured creditors face during the proceedings. It says that in addition to the primacy of commercial wisdom of COC, Section 31 of IBC 2016 states that once the resolution plan approved by the Committee of Creditors under subsection 4 of Section 30 meets the requirements as referred in subsection 2 of Section 30, it shall by order approve the resolution plan, which shall has been highlighted. I will tell you why. Be binding on the corporate debtor and its employees, members, creditors, guarantors, and other stakeholders involved in the resolution plan. So by stating these people around in this particular para, you could see that the employees, members, creditors, guarantors, and other stakeholders. Then other stakeholders is basically a very broad terminology. It engulfs a lot of people who might be not satisfied with the resolution plan, but since an embargo has been created for them under Section 31 and the commercial wisdom of the COC, so all those things come into play and they are left with nothing. So the court has tried to ensure that the execution of resolution plan can go ahead unabated. Why they have done it? The reason is given. The court has tried to ensure that the execution of resolution plan go unabated because there are both sides of it. First is if they are allowed to do that, if they believe that they do not have the right say into the resolution plan, and in addition to what they are getting is miserable for them, so they can go ahead and do that. But again, these jargons will come in and they will stop them. The other side says that if they are allowed to do that, then it will be an endless process. At every point of time, there would be a creditor saying that I am not satisfied with the repayment schedule which is enshrined in the resolution plan. I am not satisfied with it. I'm not getting what I should get. So at every point of time, you should be getting the obstacles, and which would perhaps predicate the entire timelines or the resolution process which the objective of the IBC seeks, that to complete the process within strict timeline and to get a resolution out of it, rather than compelling the creditors to resolve a resolution for getting the company into liquidation. That is not the objective. So why it has been done? Because there should be a stoppage point, that beyond that you cannot go. So that is the perspective at this point of time, apart from the jargon. So both the sides are there. The next slide will tell you what can an unsecured creditor do in order to profess its claim. So this is going to be my last slide. So from a practical perspective, I'm telling you, it is very important for an unsecured creditor to take steps at right point of time. Now, the kind of narration which you must have heard during the entire presentation, you must have got an idea that unsecured creditor has a very limited role to play. Unsecured creditors have can act in a very restricted manner when it comes to the approval of the resolution plan, or what kind of repayment schedule to be included in the resolution plan. Since the unsecured creditor are very much restricted in all the manners. So but again, since they are unsecured creditors and they have submitted their claim, so there is a right in law. There is a right under IBC to profess what according to them is right before the NCLT. So there is no stopping them. But again, the jargons will come in. So this particular paragraph states that from a practical perspective, it is very important for an unsecured creditor to take steps at a right point of time. Right point of time is very important. If you misguide your steps, you will not able to get anything. So the unsecured creditors may move an application under section 65 of IBC 2016, read with rule 11. So rule 11 is kind of section 151 of CPC, which gives an inherent power to the courts. Section rule 11 gives inherent power to the tribunals. It helps the tribunals to go one step ahead, look into the matter, and pass something which it usually will not pass in ordinary course of business. Let's just say you file an application under section 9 or 10 or 7 or 43, 45. There are so many sections. So there, the sections engulfs in itself the entire process as to how the NCLT has to proceed with those particular sections. But there should be a gate wherein the NCLT should open it and go one step further to give directions or to provide the relief which should be in tandem with the objective of this IBC, and also the IBC should ideally do it. So it's very important that to understand rule 11 and section 65, you must have seen if the participants if the advocates are there, they must appreciate and understand that there are a lot of applications filed under this particular section and this particular rule. Because when hands are tied, you have to take steps wherein the NCLT could go one step ahead. So this unsecured creditors may move an application under section 65 of IBC 2016, read with rule 11 of the National Company Law Tribunal Rules 2016, canvassing its grievances regarding the quantum of claim allotted in the resolution plan. So here the unsecured creditors are challenging the repayment schedule, which I just talked about. If an unsecured creditor is not vigilant enough to profess its grievances at the right point of time, then prospects of commercial wisdom of COC and purview of section 631 will create an embargo for an unsecured creditor and leaves it with no relief. I just talked about how they come into picture and how they play a very significant role if the steps are not taken at the right point of time. Also, the guiding principle under section 53 subsection 1 of IBC 2016 and further resorting to section regulation 38 of CIRP regulation 2016 under the light of Binani Industries and Bank of Baroda and another. I hope people would remember this judgment. This judgment came long back by the NCLAT. So NCLAT in this particular judgment talks about how the creditors are to be dealt. So it basically draws a parity between, let's just say, the parity between the operational creditor and the financial creditor. Of course, it created some sort of troubles for the judgments which came in subsequently. But it also gives out an idea as to how we can maintain the parity between different classes of creditors by not making a creditor absolutely outside the purview of his rights of getting the claim which he is supposed to get. Again, the last para says the code is designed in a way wherein the unsecured creditors have very little room for error. Any misguided step in the entire process of insolvency leading up to a resolution plan may prove fatal to the chances of realization of claims. Again, very recently, Supreme Court has stated that a claim not a part of the resolution plan does not survive. So there is a practical aspect of it. So if the time permits, I would just take 2 minutes. There is a case I'm handling right now. The unsecured creditor, why it should be a guided step, because I will tell you. The resolution professional in this particular matter asked against a public announcement when the unsecured creditor expressed his interest to submit the claim because he has a claim. So when he asked to do that, the RP told him to submit the claim under a form. So there are various forms, Form A, Form B, Form C, Form D, under which every single form is allotted to a particular class of creditor. But mistakenly, or maybe say due to some kind of misunderstanding, the RP directed the unsecured creditor to submit the claim under the form which was supposed to be for the operational creditor. It submitted the claim. However, the RP did not pay attention to it. The unsecured creditor, you could say, was uninformed regarding this, or maybe ignorant. So the proceedings went on. Subsequently, the unsecured creditor, upon some legal advice, realized that this cannot go along because I am an unsecured creditor. I cannot file a claim under the class of operational creditor. So I have given a loan. So then he realized it. He asked the RP to do it. RP took some of his own sweet time to do that. By the time this all things happened, the resolution plan was before COC and the COC approved the resolution plan. Now in the resolution plan, the unsecured creditor was under the class of operational creditor. But the quantum of amount which he was getting as an operational creditor under the resolution plan, he was not satisfied with it because he has given a very big amount of loan, although as an unsecured creditor, to the corporate. Now, then he decided, no, this is not going to work out. So I will move before the NCLAT, and I will profess my grievances, saying that I am an unsecured financial creditor. I should be, it is on the part of the RP to let me know that in what sort of form I should file it, and my claim should be addressed by the members of the COC. I was not even made a part of the COC, and my claims are not being adjudged. So at that point of time, NCLAT said that, again, if the COC has taken this call that the resolution plan of such and such resolution applicant is absolutely in tandem with the objective of the IBC and the commercial wisdom of the COC comes into play, and the NCLAT rejected the appeal, saying you are very delayed. You have come at a very later point of time. So these misguided steps can prove very fatal. And if your claim is not part of the resolution plan, then the Supreme Court has made that particular point very clear by this particular judgment at the very bottom. Ghanshyam Mishra and Sons Private Limited versus Edelweiss Asset Reconstruction Company Limited. This is a very latest, wherein it says that if a particular claim is not part of resolution plan, you cannot come at a later point of time saying that my claim should be addressed. So this is basically what the difference between unsecured and secured creditor has transpired during all this time from a practical perspective. And that would be all from my end.
Yeah, thanks, Sumit. We are running a little short of time, so
yes,
I would request that questions be taken at the end. I saw a couple of hands were being raised. I would request all those participants to please put in their questions in the chat box. We'll quickly go through the rest of the presentations, and then we will take up all the questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I request Bhargav to please take up the presentation.
Yes, in a moment. I'll just share my screen. Just a moment. Hi, good morning. I appreciate the efforts made by Sumitji, and he has elaborated in a very nice manner. So I'll quickly run through the topic today, which is a conditional resolution plan and the legal aspects surrounding a conditional resolution plan. Before we proceed as to what does a conditional resolution plan mean, let's just quickly run through the definition of a resolution plan and read it aloud for the sake of understanding purposes. A resolution plan is defined under section 5 clause 26 of the Insolvency Code, and it means a plan proposed by a resolution applicant for insolvency resolution of the corporate debtor as a going concern in accordance with part 2 of the code. I am emphasizing on the words insolvency resolution of the corporate debtor and as a going concern. Right. Now, if you look at what essentially a conditional resolution plan is, in all simpliciter terms, a conditional resolution plan is one in which there are certain conditions of prerequisites, majorly in the form of they being included in the plan as reliefs, consents, dispensations, or concessions, wherein those reliefs and concessions form such an indispensable part of the resolution plan that if they are not granted to the resolution applicant, or if those conditions are not met with or fulfilled to, then the resolution applicant will no longer be a willing resolution applicant to be bringing about a resolution of the corporate debtor, which is as per the definition of a resolution plan. So therefore, to ensure the revival of a corporate debtor and to avoid the corporate debtor from going into the purview of liquidation, there is a conditional resolution plan when the resolution applicant proposes certain conditions so as to ensure revival of a corporate debtor. Now, now before we proceed as to what the view of the COC is, or what the view of the Honorable Adjudicating Authority or the Honorable Appellate Authority is when they look at a conditional resolution plan, let's just quickly understand as to what is the point and what is the mindset of a resolution applicant while he submits a conditional resolution plan. So I understand that the feasibility and viability of a resolution plan has to be looked into by the COC, but the plan has to be firstly feasible and viable to the resolution applicant at its very threshold, right? At the very, it's a bare minimum thing. And it's an unsaid thing that if a company is under the garb or clutches of CIRP, then it's a sick company. I may not use the word sick, but it is, since it's not able to fulfill its dues towards its creditors, so therefore it's a loss-making company. So the resolution applicant, knowing that fact, is infusing money, he's infusing time, energy, and effort. And when a resolution applicant is infusing so much amount of money and effort and time, there must be certain concerns that he must have had. So therefore, those concerns are entered into the resolution plan. And according to me, as far as I believe and as far as I've been interacting in my daily routines, I've been interacting with a lot of professionals wherein they look at a conditional resolution plan. I should not be using the word in a negative manner, but they do not appreciate a conditional resolution plan. In my humble view, and with utmost respect to everybody's views and opinions, I think that a conditional resolution plan should be looked at from a leniency point of view, and at least the resolution applicant or its consultant should be given an opportunity in the COC and before the Honorable Adjudicating Authority to be presenting its case as to explaining the rationale behind such conditions being there and how will it, provided those conditions are in accordance with law and are allowed as per law, right? If those conditions are allowable by law, are implementable, are enforceable, the conditions, the rationale behind the conditions should be explained, so that the COC can deliberate and discuss upon it and holistically analyze the plan as with respect to the feasibility and viability of a plan too. Right. So this is the point of view of the RA. Moving further, let's discuss the judicial pronouncements as respect to a conditional resolution plan. A judgment of the Honorable NCLAT, namely by the name Santosh Vasantrao Walokar versus Vijay Kumar Iyer, was rendered by a full bench decision by the Honorable NCLAT on the 24th of January 2020. Right. This judgment very lucidly decides upon the issue as to what is the scope and ambit of the Honorable Adjudicating Authority while they look at a resolution plan, and is a conditional resolution plan valid in law. Amongst many other issues, one of the main issues was that if the COC has approved a conditional resolution plan, and I pause here and pose a question to myself, and you're also requested to deliberate upon that if the COC, the members of the COC who are at most concerned about the corporate debtor company and about their own dues, if they have strategically and have done an in-depth analysis of the resolution plan, they have analyzed the resolution plan from all prospects. They are satisfied that there are certain, they have agreed that there are certain conditions in the resolution plan. They are agreeable to it. They have applied their commercial wisdom. They have analyzed the feasibility and viability of the plan. So at this stage, once this is done, is the Honorable Adjudicating Authority responsible, or is there a responsibility cast upon the Adjudicating Authority to be looking at the resolution plan and revisiting it and applying its judicious mind when the COC has already applied its commercial mind? So this was discussed in this judgment, wherein many judgments of the Honorable Supreme Court were cited, more particularly the judgment of K. Shashidhar, as rightly explained by my learned friend who concluded previously, Mr. Sumitji, and the judgment of ArcelorMittal. Right. So K. Shashidhar judgment, there's a very interesting thing here. There's a very interesting point here. In the K. Shashidhar judgment was rightly said that if the COC rejects a resolution plan, the adjudicating authority is to not look at anything further and pass an order at liquidation, right? Similarly, now if you draw the same analogy here and reverse it a bit, you do reverse engineering here and say that if the COC approves the resolution plan with the requisite majority as per the code, is the adjudicating authority should simply approve the plan. But that is not being done so in majority of the cases. In my humble submission and with respect to all the NCLT benches, the NCLT benches are clearly looking at the reliefs, concessions and consents and dispensations as stipulated in the resolution plan and applying their judicious mind there. So this question was answered by the NCLAT here, wherein it was categorically said that the COC or the commercial wisdom of the COC is paramount and it cannot be negated with. The judicious mind of the NCLT cannot be applied and cannot be reversing the decision of the COC if the conditions are stipulated in the plan are in accordance with law. Let's just quickly read as to what is the operative part of the judgment here. The issue was the scope and ambit of jurisdiction of the adjudicating authority and the appellate tribunal while approving a resolution plan, whether a conditional resolution plan can be approved. The adjudicating authority and the appellate authority cannot go into the feasibility and viability of the resolution plan, which requires the commercial wisdom of the COC. The adjudicating authority and the appellate authority has to go by the various propositions of law stated above, accordingly, to which they have to go by the commercial wisdom of the COC while approving the resolution plan. The given resolution plan is conditional, but since according to the express directions given by the Supreme Court in the various cases stated above, this adjudicating authority per se will have to go to the commercial wisdom of the COC. So basically what the judgment of the Honorable NCLAT has said, that it has reinstated the law as laid down by the judgment of the Honorable Supreme Court in the matter of K. Shashidhar and ArcelorMittal. It avoided the company from going into liquidation. It sought a resolution. It sanctioned a resolution of the corporate debtor rather than putting into the clutches of liquidation. And this judgment of the Honorable NCLT was taken into appeal also before the Honorable Supreme Court, which has been upheld by the Honorable Supreme Court. So the law of the land as it stands today is that a conditional resolution plan having certain conditions or certain stipulations or certain prerequisites, which are in accordance with law, can definitely, they are presentable before the CIC, enforceable, implementable, and approvable by the Honorable Adjudicating Authority. So there is whatever ambiguity is there with respect to the conditional resolution plan being not presentable before the COC or not, it cannot be drafted, it cannot be approved. Those are all hocus pocus, and it has to be, it's a known fact as of today that a resolution plan which is conditional is good in law. It's a good law. Furthermore, there's another judgment that I would like to discuss. By a very interesting turn of events, in the very successive month after the present judgment that we discussed right now was rendered on the 24th of January, this judgment was rendered by a division bench of the same appellate tribunal, NCLAT, almost a month after the previous judgment. This judgment was rendered on the 20th of February 2020. The previous judgment was rendered on the 24th of January 2020. So this judgment simply says, with utter disregard to the previous judgment of the Honorable NCLAT, which was rendered by a larger bench, it simply states that a conditional resolution plan is an unacceptable one, and it says that it is in negation of law, right? So it says that a conditional resolution plan is not approvable since it is in violation of section 30 clause 2 subclause E. Now, if you look at 30 subclause 2 subclause E for a moment, 30 clause 2 subclause E states that the resolution professional shall examine each resolution plan received by him to confirm that each resolution plan does not contravene any of the provisions of the law for the time being in force. Right? So essentially the reliefs is sought for by the resolution applicant in the present application, in the present NCLAT appeal, was with respect to seeking a direction from the Honorable NCLT or the NCLAT for evicting a particular person from a particular property. So the NCLAT rightly said that I cannot be passing an eviction order, but you may go to the relevant authority, and if it is in accordance with law, you can definitely seek an order. That should have been the right scenario. But without even considering in an utter disregard to the decision of the COC or the judgment of the Honorable NCLAT, which was passed by a larger bench, in my humble view and with utmost respect to this judgment, I consider this to be per incurium because this judgment has been passed by ignoring the previous judgment. So therefore, I do not consider this to be a good law. Moreover, this judgment has also been taken into appeal with the Honorable Supreme Court and is currently pending for consideration. Let's just quickly read the operative part of the order here. It's in clause C. In reality, ascribing conditions in the resolution plan by the appellant or resolution applicant is an unacceptable one in the considered opinion of this tribunal. Therefore, the adjudicating authority in the impugned order came to the right conclusion that the plan of the resolution applicant or appellant was a negation of law. In my humble view, this judgment is not a good law as according to me, subject to correction. And because the previous judgment of the NCLAT is rendered by a larger bench, which has also been upheld by the Honorable Supreme Court, the law of the land as it stands today is that a conditional resolution plan is valid in law and is implementable and approvable. Yes. So now we'll be linking the conditional resolution plan with a very interesting topic, which is withdrawal of a resolution plan. Now, it has been rendered by a lot of judgments nowadays. I have mentioned the judgments here by the name Kundan Care Products versus Amit Gupta, and there's a judgment of Educom Solutions. There's another judgment of the Honorable Supreme Court in Maharashtra Seamless, wherein it has been categorically held that a resolution applicant whose resolution plan has been approved by the COC cannot now take a U-turn and say that I'm no longer a willing resolution applicant and I want to withdraw from the resolution plan. The judgment of Kundan Care is currently stayed by the Honorable Supreme Court, subject to correction, but we'll discuss it for the sake of brevity and convenience, right? So, for discussion purposes, we can say, and we can affirmatively state as of today that as per the judicial pronouncements, a resolution applicant whose plan has been approved cannot withdraw from a approved resolution plan. Now, there's a very recent judgment of the Honorable NCLT Bengaluru bench rendered in the month of March or April 2021, which is by the name Kundan Care Products and Sagar Power Private Limited. In this judgment with the Honorable NCLT Bengaluru bench, Kundan Care was again the resolution applicant. It was stated by Kundan Care that there are some misappropriations, or there are some misstatements, or there are some incorrect information in the information memorandum. So therefore, I have submitted my plan on the basis of there being certain information in the information memorandum. And I consider that information memorandum to be the primary document or the Gita while I draft my resolution plan. Since it was admitted by the resolution professional in that such matter that there were some discrepancies in the information memorandum, the NCLT Bangalore bench categorically allowed and stated that yes, the resolution applicant cannot be jeopardizing his own interest while he submits a resolution plan, since the information memorandum acts as the primary source or the document on which the information is gathered by the resolution applicant. And if that information is incorrect or there are certain misstatements made there, the resolution applicant cannot be forced to jeopardize his own interest and implement the resolution plan. So therefore, he was allowed to withdraw the resolution plan. Now, applying this analogy with respect to a conditional resolution plan, I pause here for a moment and pose a question to myself and everyone here, and you all can deliberate and ponder upon it, that if I have stipulated certain conditions in the resolution plan, and as according to the previous judicial pronouncements, a conditional resolution plan has been held to be valid by the Honorable NCLAT and the Honorable Supreme Court, that means a conditional resolution plan is valid in law, correct? Now, if a conditional resolution plan is valid in law, if certain conditions are stipulated in the resolution plan, which are very essential and indispensable for me, and if those conditions have not been met, supposedly I'm asking for a benefit that had to be accrued to me by under the MSME Act or under some statutory provision. I was relying on that I was relying on that benefit to be accruing to me, but due to some unfortunate incident, the resolution applicant could not avail that benefit. So can he now come and say, in lieu of this judgment of the Honorable NCLT Bengaluru bench, that since I was relying on that particular provision and you approved my resolution plan, but since I was not able to avail that particular benefit, therefore I want to withdraw from the resolution plan. So therefore, this is one question that the dust is yet to be settled on this question. So I request all of you to be deliberating upon this, and we are awaiting the decision of the Honorable Supreme Court with respect to both the matters, and let's see how the dust settles. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhargav, for such insightful yet crisp presentation. We'll come back to the questions at the end. Richa, I request you to take up the screen now.
Yeah, first of all, I would like to thank all the participants for joining in the session. I'll just start my screen sharing in a moment. I hope everyone is able to see my screen.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
So my topic for discussion today is commercial wisdom of COC with respect to resolution plans. So when we think about the term commercial wisdom, I'm sure most of you might have heard the term a whole lot of time while we are dealing with IBC cases, while we're talking about resolution plans. So what do you mean when you say commercial wisdom? Commercial wisdom basically means over here that the COC has a decision-making power to approve or reject a resolution plan. It has the power to make business decisions with respect to a defaulting corporate debtor, to see whether the plan is actually feasible and viable, and whether it's actually implementable by the resolution applicant. So while we discuss the definition of commercial wisdom, let us see from where this term was brought in, as in whether it was nomenclature which was brought in by the judicial pronouncements, or whether it was existing in the provisions of the code, or whether it was there at the very inception while the framers of the code were framing the legislation. So moving to the intent of the legislators, we may see that the legislators, while they were discussing the code, they were talking about who will comprise of the COC, whether the financial creditors will be part of the COC or the operational creditors, workmen, employee will also be a part of the COC. So while they were discussing all the possibilities of who will be included in the COC meetings, they had discussed that with the decision-making power of approving a resolution plan, of approving the rehabilitation of the company should lie with the financial creditors. So this is an extract which I've taken from the Bankruptcy Law Report Committee, where it is stated that when a corporate debtor commits default, the default is mostly with respect to all kinds of debt. The debts which have already been, details of which have already been spoken by Mr. Sumit in his previous slides. The question arises about what is to be done. So there are various options which are available. There is option of liquidating the company. The company may be sold by way of going concern sale. So there are various options which has to be looked into. So now, since the corporate debtor has already defaulted, the possibilities obviously will not be envisaged by the corporate debtor itself. The creditors will, since there's a loss to the creditors, the committee believed that there's only one correct forum for evaluating all the possibilities and making a decision. And for that, they emphasized the possibility of forming a creditors committee, which later was termed as the committee of creditors, including all the financial creditors. And the further the BLC, while choosing this COC members who will constitute COC, they discussed that the legislature and court must not have the control of the whole resolution process. They should not be burdened about deciding whether resolution is possible or not. So those decisions, being a business decision, since the major haircut is of the creditors, the committee emphasized that it's better that the COC members take this decision. So in this regard, there were few amendments that were made in the IBC where they included certain provisions with respect to what will be the decision of the, what will be the role of the COC, the role of the RP, and the role of the A. So the two important provisions here are section 30 and section 31. So in section 30, the IBC provides that the RP will examine the resolution plan. The prelim examination will be done by the RP. So the factors on which the examination will be done have been provided in section 30. So approximately 6 factors have been provided. Whether the CRP cost has been provided or not, whether the payment is being made to operational creditors or not. So with respect to payment to operational creditors, again, it has been provided that the amount should not be less than what they would have received in liquidation. Whether the dissenting financial creditors who have not approved the plan, whether they are being paid a minimum amount or not, whether the plan provides for the management of the affairs of the company after approval of the plan. So who will be in charge of the management and control of the company? Whether there's a provision for implementation and supervision of the plan, who will supervise the plan, whether how the implementation will be carried on, what will be the implementation period, and also to look into that the plan does not contravene any provisions of the code or any other law for the time being in force. So while the RP carries out these preliminary examination, once it finds that these pointers are conformed to, it places the resolution plan before the COC for its approval. Now this voting power of the COC is given. The COC will approve a plan with not less than 66% voting shares. So it will consider the plan on the basis of whether it's feasible and viable. What is the manner of distribution proposed in the plan? So again, the commercial wisdom, the business decision is being taken by the COC here. They will also take into account the priority that is given to the creditors, whether what is the resolution value and what is the liquidation value that they might receive. They will consider all the aspects and then they will decide whether the plan is to be approved or not. They will not look into the prelim aspect which the RP has already looked into. Now, once the COC has approved the plan, as you all are aware, the next stage is approval of the adjudicating authority. So the adjudicating authority will not have much power, much role here. So adjudicating authority, if it's satisfied that the plan conforms to the requirement of the law, it will approve the law. So approve the plan. So here, if you see what is the factors that the adjudicating authority is to look into. So adjudicating authority will see whether the RP has done the prelim verification or not. If anyone objects to the plan that it does not mean to the requirement of the code, in that case, the adjudicating authority will see whether the 6 criteria which were laid down as the prelim criteria, whether those are not being fulfilled. If it's not being fulfilled, the adjudicating authority may reject the plan. So in that case also, the power has been given to the adjudicating authority that it may reject the plan or it may approve the plan. Generally, if it does not conform to the basic requirements laid down in the code, adjudicating authority will not approve the plan. But it will not look into how much is being paid to all the creditors, whether there's any disparity between secured or unsecured creditor, financial or operational creditors. Just the basic, if the dissenting financial creditors' right have been taken care or not, the operational creditors are being paid the liquidation value or not. The basic 6 pointers that has been given under section 30/2, the IA will look into that and then reject or approve the plan. Moving ahead, these are the 4 case laws which I will discuss, which I will be discussing in my later slides. So these are the 4 landmark judgments with respect to commercial wisdom of COC, which has been taken up by the Supreme Court, the apex court of India. So the first landmark case was the case of K. Shashidhar versus Indian Overseas Bank. Of course, there has been n number of cases by NCLAT also now, where they have discussed this issue of commercial wisdom of COC. One of the cases was already discussing the whether the conditional resolution plan is valid or not. So we'll come to that in later slides. So in the case of K. Shashidhar, the basic issue here was there were 2 resolution plans and 2 companies which were involved. So in the case of Kamini Steel and Power India Limited, the NCLT Hyderabad had approved the plan which did not receive majority COC approval. So during that time, this was prior to amendment. So 75% COC approval was required, but the requisite approval was not obtained. In fact, there were certain creditors who had abstained from voting. So in that case, also removing those creditors also from the list, the 75% requisite was not fulfilled. So in that case, the NCLT had approved the plan despite the resolution plan not receiving the requisite vote. So when this matter went to challenge before the NCLAT reprimanded the proceedings back to NCLT, stating that the right approach is to order for liquidation under section 33. And the NCLT cannot go ahead and approve the resolution plan which has not been approved by COC, because the first step is approval by COC. Only then the NCLT can approve or reject the plan. So in this case, the important point which was raised for discussion was whether the RP, the NCLT or the NCLAT can reverse the decision of COC. So this matter came up before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court had the following observations. It observed that the commercial wisdom of COC is paramount and judicial intervention cannot be done in such cases. So to ensure that the IBC timelines are being adhered to, these judicial intervention, the litigation, all of these things will hamper the timelines of IBC and also the object of the code. So here the Supreme Court held that since the remedy of appeal has already been provided under IBC, there are limited grounds of appeal which has been provided. Like I discussed, section 30/2, there are 6 pointers. Only if those points are not fulfilled, only in that cases NCLT can object or reject the resolution plan. Other than that, there are no other grounds under which an appeal can be filed before NCLAT or before the Supreme Court. So here again, the decision was that the legislature has not given any power to the RP or the adjudicating authority to reverse the commercial decision of COC. So coming to the next case, so the case of Committee of Creditors of SR Steel. So this is a very important case. This was a landmark judgment where this has been relied on by n number of cases now. Most of the NCLAT and NCLT are relying on this case. They have discussed the scope of commercial wisdom. What is the scope that the commercial wisdom of the COC? which has been provided under the provision of law. So the brief facts have been provided here. The NCLT conditionally approved the plan of ArcelorMittal, suggesting that to avoid discrimination, the COC should reconsider the manner of distribution in the manner that the dissenting financial creditor, Standard Chartered, and some of the operational creditors are paid in the same proportion in which the secured financial creditors are being paid. So once this approval was granted, this approval was challenged by various parties, including several operational creditors, suspended the board of directors, and former promoters of the corporate debtor. When the matter came up for hearing before the NCLAT approved the resolution plan. However, with respect to certain conditions, it said that the distribution structure will have to be modified, and all the stakeholders will have to be given at least 60% share. It also granted certain, provided for certain additional conditions also in the resolution plan. And then the approval was challenged before the Supreme Court, wherein the basic challenge was whether the NCLAT can provide for conditional approval of the resolution plan. There were no conditions in the resolution plan originally, but NCLAT had itself included certain conditions. So whether that could be done. So when the matter came up before the Supreme Court, the basic issue that Supreme Court considered was whether the COC have approved the resolution plan, whether after that the commercial wisdom can be challenged before the NCLT, whether the NCLT or appellate authority can change the manner of payment that is being proposed by the resolution plan. So here again, relating on the previous judgment of K. Shashidhar, the Supreme Court held that there is no doubt that the ultimate decision-making power is with the COC. To what is to be paid, to what category of creditors, secured, unsecured, financial, operational, all of it has to be decided by the COC. COC will take into consideration the interest of all the stakeholders, will maximize the value of assets of the corporate debtor, and accordingly approve or reject the resolution plan. So the limited scope of review that is being given to the adjudicating authority cannot be contravened. And the only option that the adjudicating authority has is to reprimand the plan back to the COC to make revised suggestions or changes if possible. Next is the case of Maharashtra Seamless Limited versus Padmabhan Venkatesh and others. So in this case, what had happened was that the resolution value was much lower than the liquidation value. So the NCLT Hyderabad approved the plan while the COC had also approved the plan. So in this case, there was a challenge before NCLAT that the liquidation value is much higher than the resolution value. So can such a plan? So in this case, the Supreme Court had said that it's a commercial wisdom of COC if they think that the resolution value is, even if it is lower than the liquidation value, the plan can be approved, then there's no ground for challenge at all. So this is a very recent case, Kalparaj Dharmraj. In this case, the COC had accepted the plan after the expiry of the timeline provided in the RFRP. So as we all know, RFRP provides for a schedule of timelines that the EOI has to be submitted within a particular date. The plan has to be submitted within a particular date. So while the challenger, they had provided the EOI and resolution plan within the specified timeline, the plan of the successful resolution applicant was submitted after the timeline. So here, such plan was approved by the COC and also by NCLT. But when the appeal was filed before NCLAT had told that only the plans which has been filed before the timeline will be considered and no other. Then the matter came up before the Supreme Court for consideration. The Supreme Court held that if the COC has considered that the plan is better than the other plans which they had received within the timeline, then in that case, the NCLT shall not have any right to not accept such resolution plan, giving the object of the code for the purpose of maximization of assets of the stakeholders, and also the other objects of the code is resolution of the plan. So it's better to resolve a company than to let it go into liquidation. So in that case, in this case also, the Supreme Court held that NCLT or NCLAT cannot interfere with the commercial decision of COC. So here the key takeaways in the ruling were the evaluation of the resolution plan will be done by the COC and the NCLT will have no role on it. The commercial wisdom will be given paramount status, which has been time again held by the Supreme Court in various other rulings also, which we have discussed. There's no provision in the code which provides that NCLT can review the commercial wisdom of the COC. The only ground for challenge is section 30/2, which has already been discussed earlier. So while we have discussed these cases, there are few questions that may arise before us. We may think that there have been an assumption by the Supreme Court that the COC is the best authority to decide whether the plan is feasible or non-viable. How will the COC decide whether the plan is feasible or viable? They are not running the company. They are not in charge of any of the companies. How will they know if the plan is implementable or not? So for that, they may hire a team of experts and they may discuss with them whether the plan is feasible. They will have multiple plans in hand. They will do a comparative analysis of which plan is better. So accordingly, they will decide. Since they are the ones who are taking the substantial haircut, they are the ones who should have the decision-making power. So concluding with what are the obligations of the COC and what are the obligations of the adjudicating authority, I would say that whether a plan is acceptable or not, whether to resolve a corporate debtor or not, will be decision of the COC. The commercial wisdom is supreme. What are the obligations of COC while considering a plan? They will have to consider that the plan provides for priority of payment of operational creditors in reference to financial creditors. Since the financial creditors are making approving the plan, they should not hamper the interest of the other stakeholders. They should balance the interest of all the stakeholders. The asset value maximization should be done. Maximum value that can be fetched for the asset, they should try to obtain. The plan should be feasible and viable. The resolution applicant should demonstrate in the plan that they are capable of implementing the plan. How will they implement? What will be the implementation schedule? These things which we have already seen that most of the resolution plan contains. Also, to ensure that CD is being kept as a going concern. When you see the role of the NCLT, you see that a limited role have been given. Appeal can only be done under the scope that has been provided in section 30/2. If the COC has fulfilled its obligation, the NCLT will have to approve the plan. Otherwise, it may send it back to the COC for making further changes. While we have discussed so many provisions and case laws, we will also note that there are certain cases in practicality we see that there are certain cases while we see that the liquidation value, what is generally the liquidation value that is being paid to the operational creditors? Section 53, it talks about the priority of payment, which has already been dealt with by Mr. Kumar. We will see that section 53 mostly talks about the first priority will be given to CIRP payment, second will be given to secured creditors, and the dues of the workmen for 24 months. So in this case, we will see that mostly the payment that is being done reaches level 2 and it doesn't go beyond that. So no dues payable to employees or to unsecured creditors and to other stakeholders. So we see that generally the liquidation value for operational creditors or unsecured creditors is nil. So in resolution plan, whether if this nil payment being done to the operational creditors and unsecured creditors, whether that is acceptable or not, that is something still it's a matter of deliberation. While most of the NCLT and NCLAT judgment is clear about the fact that if the liquidation value is nil and if the financial creditors think that since the liquidation value is nil and no payment should be paid to such creditors, in that case, there is nothing that NCLT or NCLAT can do. But should not the adjudicating authority look into these aspects as well? This is a question I pose to you for deliberation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richa. Request Rishabh to kindly proceed with his presentation.
Good morning to all. First of all, I would like to thank ILA for providing me for this wonderful opportunity to present my views on this section 29A along with the resolution plan. My learned friends have already explained in detail the intricacies of this topic. So I would like to keep my presentation short. Is my screen visible?
It's coming up.
Yeah. So I'll be discussing on.
Yes.
So I'll be discussing on the topic section 29A, that is the bridge towards a resolution plan. Initially, there was no conditions in submitting any resolution plan. After the amendment and the insertion of this section 29A in the year 2017, this resolution plan submission was led by certain conditions, that is it needs to be evaluated as per the 29A, whether the person submitting the resolution plan is liable to submit the resolution plan, and the section 29A needs to be checked. What was the
Do you
need
want
for
to make it full screen, please? Sorry to disturb you. Yeah, thank you.
So what was the need for insertion of this section 29A under this IBC code 2016? As we have known that earlier, a resolution applicant could have been any person who submits a resolution plan to the resolution plan, and a resolution plan could be a plan proposed by any person for the revival of the corporate debtor. There was no such specific criteria which a person needs to follow, or any guidelines was there. But after the insertion of this section, the scope of the wide scope permitted by the code served as a loophole and paved a way for the promoters to gain a backdoor entry to the management of the corporate debtor, subsequently leading to an undue advantage of the provision, which would defeat the purpose of this IBC. What we have seen that many promoters who were ineligible before the enactment of this section were able to gain a backdoor entry through this resolution, through the means of resolution plan. But after this, the enactment of this particular section, this thing was curtailed by this section. The main intention behind inserting this section 29A was to restrict those persons from submitting resolution plan who were the main culprit or the reason behind the company for getting them into this CIRP process. As per the IBC section 29A, section 29A says that first criteria is the person is an undischarged insolvent, is a willful defaulter as per RBI guidelines issued under Banking Regulation Act 1949. If such person or a corporate debtor under the management and control of such person of corporate debtor of whom such person is a promoter at the time of submission of resolution plan has an NPA account as per RBI guideline, having completed at least 1 year as on ICD, provided that such person would become eligible if he clears the dues in full time of submission of resolution plan. D says has been convicted for any offense punishable with imprisonment for 2 or more years under this act specified in 12th schedule. Second says for 7 or more years under any other law, provided that this clause will not apply 2 years after the date of his release from imprisonment. E says is disqualified to be a director under the Companies Act 2013, prohibited by SEBI trading or assessing the securities market. G says has been a promoter or in management or control of a CD against whom an adverse order is passed by AA in respect of avoidance transaction under section 43, 45, 50 and 66. H says has executed a guarantee in favor of a creditor of a CD under CIRP initiated by such creditor and the application has been admitted and such guarantee has been invoked by the creditor and remains unpaid. I says is subject to any disability corresponding to clause A to H under any law in jurisdiction outside India, or clause J says has a connected person not eligible under clause A to I above. Connected person shall mean any person who is a promoter or in management to control of resolution applicant. 2. Any person who is promoter or in the management of the corporate control of the business of the CD during the implementation of resolution plan. Third says the holding company, subsidiary company, associate company or related party of a person mentioned in clause I and 2. It is also pertinent to note that the term, that is person actly, jointly, or in concern, has not been mentioned in the code, but the code provides for the expression that has not been defined under the code, and the same can be taken from SEBI Act 1992. Section 29A is a restrictive provision, that is, any person falling in the negative list is not eligible to submit a resolution plan. However, we have seen that section 240A, it says that if a company or a corporate debtor is MSN, is a micro, small, medium, small enterprises, then the promoter or that of that company is eligible to submit the resolution plan, subject to that clause C to H will not be applicable on him. If we talk about the ineligibility tiers, a detailed analysis of section 29A reveals that this section imposes 4 tiers of ineligibility. First tier is that the person, he himself or itself, is an ineligible person. Second tier is where a connected person is ineligible. Third tier is a related party of that connected person is ineligible. And fourthly, where a person acting or jointly in concert with person suffering from first tier, second tier, and third tier becomes ineligible. Now relieves an exemption to the parties. As I have discussed that promoter having NPA account of corporate debtor who are MSME, they can participate in this. Further, pure financial entities who are investors in NPA account are not disqualified under section 29A of the IBC. But recently in the matter of UARCL, they were debarred under 29A as they were the asset reconstruction company. And RBI says that this is not, the plan does not confront to the guidelines of the SARFAESI Act, and RBI says that they need the ARC's company need prior permission or approval of RBI before submission of this resolution plan. In one of the cases, that is ArcelorMittal India Private Limited versus Satish Kumar Gupta and others, the Honorable Supreme Court was of the opinion that Clause C, the first provision to subclause C, it makes clear that ineligibility can only be removed if the person submitting the resolution plan has cleared all their debts. If a person who intends to submit a resolution plan for the corporate debtor for their revival, they first needs to clear their own dues and they must pay off their dues so that they can participate in the said process. The RBL Bank Limited versus MBL Infrastructure Limited. In this, the Honorable NCLT of Kolkata decided that they interpreted the clause H of section 29A, and it was held that during moratorium, a personal guarantee personal guarantee could not be barred from being a resolution applicant under 29A, and any person who is falling under this, they can submit their resolution plan. Now coming to JP Infratech case, in this the Honorable Supreme Court observed that the promoters were disqualified from submitting a resolution plan as they fall under the purview of section 29A, and they were willful defaulters and hence they were not allowed to participate in the process. One of the very important case of Ruchi Soya, where Adani Wilmar was emerged as one of the successful bidder of the matter, and the second highest bid was raised by Patanjali Ayurved, and since they were not able to make it to this resolution process, they took the shield of section 29A, and accordingly, when the matter was raised to a higher tribunal, it was held that the managing partner of Adani Wilmar is having blood relation with the defaulter promoter, means that she is the daughter of the defaulter daughter. So Patanjali said that it is a biased selection for the same, and they approached the NCLT challenging the decision. And at later stage, Patanjali was emerged as the successful bidder for this matter. Coming to section 29A, and what I believe that the main intention of this code is to remove those person from the race who are initially responsible for the downfall of the corporate debtor, and they themselves were not able to revive the business, or due to their own antecedents or due to their own management failure, the company went into CIRP. Though one size fits all, it's not the criteria here. Those companies who falls under the purview of MSME, they are allowed to bid for the company, but with certain restrictions. That's all.
Thank you, Rishabh.
Okay.
Gagan sir, may I now request you to take up the next part in the session? With the
Yeah,
question and answer.
so we now take a few questions from the audience. And to begin with, Mr. Bhutani has asked, and I'll ask this question to Richa only, that can COC modify RP resolution plan once approved under section 31 by the adjudicating authority?
No, once the resolution plan has been approved by the adjudicating authority under section 31, there is no provision in the code which provides that the plan can be modified, or because once it has been approved, it has the trigger has taken place, right? So in that case, implementation will have to be done, and there's no possibility of making any changes. However, in certain circumstances, given the lockdown situation, we have seen that the NCLT has exercise their power under Rule 11, which is the inherent power of NCLT, and they have allowed modification in the implementation schedule. So suppose the payment was to be made in 6 months, however, due to certain extraneous circumstances, they are not able to make payment due to lockdown or due to financial crunch. In that situation, the taking the approval of COC, the resolution applicant has filed an application or through the RP, and the adjudicating authority has considered these aspects. So this will be very few cases where the NCLT will exercise this inherent power, and generally it will be seen that the plans will not be modified once it has been approved by adjudicating authority.
Thank you, Richa. I hope Mr. Bhutani's question has been answered to his satisfaction. I now come to Rishabh. Rishabh, whether employee's salary is covered or can the employees be regarded as unsecured creditors?
So the employees, they have a specific form for submission of their claim. And regarding the security, so yes, they are unsecured creditor, but as per section 53, their hierarchy is that if an employee is working for the last 24 months or 12 months, their due should be cleared in advance.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions audience have? Because I had a couple of questions.
Hello, sir. I have one question. So if the resolution plan is approved by COC, but before the approval by adjudicating authority, another resolution plan comes, which is better than the one which is previously approved. How can the COC again, consider the resolution plan which is better than the previous one?
Generally, the situation is that once the COC has approved the resolution plan, the application is filed before the adjudicating authority for approval. Since you are saying that the order of approval has not been received from the adjudicating authority, but the application might have been filed. So in that case, it might be seen that the COC will not have any power to go back and disapprove the resolution plan or consider any other plan, because there are certain timelines also which has been prescribed in the code. So you cannot go back to the process again and again.
Thank you, ma'am.
There's a question from Mr. Bhutani, follow-up question. is that can pre-packed insolvency work for MSME?
So that will require a separate session in itself because it's such a huge topic.
Okay.
Because pre-pack insolvency is something which we might like to speak about, but not in today's session. We'll be taking up. I'll speak to Madhura. If she permits, we'll take another session on pre-pack.
I know it's a huge topic. One more question has come is that can government companies have resolution plan? Bhargav, will you take it? Or Sumit may take it.
Am I audible? Hello?
Yes, yes, you are.
Yes. So currently, as far as I believe, and as per my limited understanding, I do not think so. A government company can be falling under the purview of the code currently, as per my understanding. But I need to check that up subject to correction. But as per my understanding goes, it cannot come until today. I think so.
Yeah, and also I think it is very unlikely that insolvency proceeding may be filed against a government company and which may be approved, and a resolution plan may be filed against a government company because
True.
Yes,
If a government company is a corporate debtor and he's being dragged into this IBC process, then I think resolution plan can be submitted process.
Yeah. So considering that we have actually overshot our time, so I'll not take follow-up questions. If the audience have a question, then we can take it up. Otherwise, we would like to close the session now. Thanks everyone. Thanks Richa, Rishabh, Sumit, Bhargav for the wonderful presentation. It was a pleasure hearing you, and I know the topic itself is a so huge topic. Each aspect of the section will go into various sessions. So, and considering the way the law is continuously evolving, it is indeed interesting. New philosophies are emerging. Like the other day, I was reading a judgment whether 138 would survive in case moratorium has been imposed. So yes, I look forward to many more such sessions on insolvency. And over to you, Madhura.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. Thanks to all the speakers for their valuable insights. Gagan sir, many thanks to you for sparing your valuable time with us. I'll just end by sharing what's upcoming at ILA. On next Friday, that's 2nd of July, we have the next session on IBC where we'll be dealing with group insolvency, personal guarantors and limitations under IBC. And then the next week, Thursday, 8th of July, there is a session on the POSH law. So all these updates will be available on ILA website, and we'll of course send you all the details of ILA events, activities, and we'd like to invite all of you actually to engage with what all we do. So please expect an email from our side by Monday. Yes, that's it for today. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great weekend. The recording of this session will be available on ILA YouTube channel. We'll also share the link for that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you so
you.
much.